So the format for this webinar would be that we have 5 presentations, about 15 minutes each. And then afterwards, we have about 45 minutes of Q&As, panel discussion. And for the first presentation, I'll kind of introduce the Philosophy of Psychiatry Educator Network and talk a little bit about sort of like my own involvement in philosophy of psychiatry education. And we have a wonderful list of speakers and panelists. I'm sure that you're going to enjoy this discussion. For Q&As, for questions, you can type them in the chat box. We're not going to address the questions during the presentations, so we will wait until all 5 of the presentations are done. And then I'll moderate the questions and we can discuss them one by one, as well as solicit additional questions and queries from the audience. So about me, no financial conflicts of interest in this regard. I'm a clinical assistant professor of psychiatry at Case Western Reserve University. I lead the series Conversations in Critical Psychiatry for Psychiatric Times. And I'm also executive council member of Association for the Advancement of Philosophy and Psychiatry, as well as Royal College Psychiatry Philosophy Specialty Interest Group. I'm the senior media editor for the journal Philosophy, Psychiatry, and Psychology. And I'm also fairly active on Twitter, if anyone is interested in following me there. So the outline of the talk, as I mentioned, the first thing is going to be introduction to the Educator Network. This is a new thing that we are launching under the umbrella of INPP. And then we'll also briefly talk about my approach to philosophy of psychiatry education and the notion of conceptual competence and experience as educator. So the Philosophy of Psychiatry Educator Network, the network aims to bring together educators of philosophy of psychiatry and relevant disciplines. So things like philosophy of medicine, philosophy of neuroscience, philosophy of psychology, things that are related enough to psychiatry that we can sort of like, benefit from including them as well. Now, one of the things is that this network is not primarily intended to be for general discussions of philosophy of psychiatry. I'm sure a lot of such discussions will happen as well, but that's not the primary intention or primary goal. The primary focus is going to be on education. And so what we really want to do is that we want sort of like a network that brings together educators. And because this is currently a gap, is that although we have different sorts of platforms and venues where people have access to philosophy of psychiatry resources, but we don't have a lot of things that are specific to educators in this regard. And so this network is intended to kind of fill that gap. So the network will allow educators to connect with each other, share resources. If sort of like if any question comes up for someone as they're, let's say, preparing a curriculum or planning for a class, they can get input from their colleagues. Discuss strategies to teach philosophical topics more effectively to clinical trainees, collaborate on scholarly endeavors, and promote education in philosophy of psychiatry. I think there's certainly a lot of scholarly work to be done in this regard as well, that is more education focused. So one of the things is that this network is intended to have a particular emphasis on medical trainees, that is medical students, residents, fellows. And this is partly because, I guess, because of my background, because I'm a physician, I'm a psychiatrist. But this is also because this is one area where there's really a sort of like a lot of neglect. So there's a lot of philosophy of psychiatry education that happen in philosophy departments, to a certain extent, sort of like, in other places like psychology, and there are devoted courses. So I think it's fairly common at this point that, let's say, like undergraduate students or sort of like our graduate students in philosophy are able to access courses that are specific to philosophy of psychiatry. But the presence of philosophy of psychiatry in medical education is basically negligible. For practical purposes, it's sort of like it's not formally included anyway. And so that's one thing I want to try to change, and I want to use the network to help us with that. Is that how can we formally include philosophy of psychiatry in medical training at different levels? But I want to say this emphasis is not intended to be restricted in any way with regards to functioning of the network. It doesn't mean that we don't welcome educators that are teaching philosophy students, that are teaching sort of like undergrads, that are teaching psychologists or neuroscientists. I mean, I think educators are all sorts of all backgrounds are welcome, sort of like, and this would be of benefit to everyone, because philosophy of psychiatry is by its very nature, multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary. So so we will benefit from sort of like, learning from each other and sharing resources. But I do want to say that given what I perceive as the sort of like this dire situation in medical education and the absence of philosophy of psychiatry there, that is one of the priorities for me personally when it comes to this network. So the writing of functioning. So it's going to function as an email listserv, and we have sort of like, we're doing that to Google Groups. And this is the sort of like the network URL on the Google Groups website. So if you want to sort of like, if you go to the Google Groups website and you want to search, if you type in INPP Philosophy of Psychiatry Educator Network, sort of like, it'll come up. Now, if someone has a Gmail address, they can go to the website and they can request to join the network. But the simplest way to do that, I think, for, especially for people who don't have a Gmail address, is just email me and I'll add you. So this is my email address, awaisaftab@gmail.com. Email me, I'll add you to the network. We sort of like, right now we have created it and we've sort of like done some sort of like test emails to test this functionality, but we haven't formally initiated any sort of conversation on that. So this is intended to be the launch. So we'll have a brief period of 2-3 weeks where we'll sort of like, we'll add people who are interested in the group, and then we can sort of like get the conversation going. So if you're interested, note down this email me, I'll add you to the list. And we'll also create a page on the INPP website with description and instruction on, so that people sort of like who search for it afterwards can find it. And so the network, the organizational partners, obviously, it exists under the INPP umbrella, also with the sort of like, the Centers for Value-Based Medicine and Value-Based Practice. So we have Association for Advancement of Philosophy and Psychiatry. We have the Royal College of Psychiatry Philosophy Specialty Interest Group. We have the World Psychiatric Association section for Philosophy and Humanities and Psychiatry. And we have University of Texas at San Antonio Medical Humanities Program. So we're very great to sort of like have all these collaborations with these institutions. And we have representatives from each of them as part of this webinar as well. So just to sort of like, a few minutes about my own approach as an educator, I really like this quote by Isaiah Berlin on sort of like what philosophy is about. He writes, "The task of philosophy, often a difficult and painful one, is to extricate and to bring to light the hidden categories and models in terms of which human beings think, to reveal what is obscure or contradictory in them, to discern the conflicts between them that prevent the construction of more adequate ways of organizing and describing and explaining experience, and then at a still higher level to examine the nature of this activity itself." And I think when I think about medicine and when I think about psychiatry and what a philosophical approach can offer, especially to clinicians, to trainees, to researchers, is that we can sort of like, we can bring to light these hidden assumptions, categories, and models that that clinicians and researchers are using to make sense of psychological suffering, psychiatric distress. And after bringing them to light, we can sort of like, we can see what is obscure or contradictory or challenging about them, and we can tackle that in a more explicit manner. So this kind of like, so the approach I often take is something that sort of like looks at implicit assumptions, and you can call it implicit bias in science, medicine, and in psychiatry. And these assumptions are sort of like prevalent across all of medicine. And they can relate to, for example, in psychiatry, the nature of psychiatric conditions, psychological suffering, what can we know about it? How can we know about it? And what sort of norms sort of like, guide its practice? So these assumptions influence, justify, and enable scientific and psychiatric practice. And I often sort of like, I see it as my task as an educator is to try to sort of like make these assumptions that have so far been hidden, implicit, more explicit for the trainees and for the clinicians, so that then they can be sort of like, challenged and if discussed and if needed, replaced. And this is just a quote from Robert Spitzer, kind of similar, articulating a similar sentiment that physicians, including psychiatrists, give a lot of thought in their everyday work to answer the question of whether or not a particular patient has a disorder. They rarely give much thought to the broader issue of what constitutes a disorder. similar kind of thing, that these things are often in the background, hidden, not getting much thought. There's a lot of talk about brain disorders over the last 10 to 15 years. And I find it's very common, and sort of like in trainees are particularly susceptible, but they often don't have a good idea of what exactly does that mean, what sort of assumptions they're making, and what does that say about their understanding of psychological sort of like suffering and psychiatric condition. So it's always helpful to bring them up. So philosophy of psychiatry has kind of like really flourished as an academic discipline over the last 3 decades, but it has remained insulated. From psychiatric education, basically psychiatry has remained insulated from it. And this really has not been given the prominence that it deserved in psychiatric education. It has not been on the agenda. So this is a paper that I and Scott Waterman, he might be in the audience as well, we sort of like wrote for academic psychiatry, and we presented the notion of conceptual competence. And this was our sort of like framework as a way of like integrating philosophical thinking in education in a manner that might be more sort of like favorable to the way educators think. And we defined it as conceptual competence in the context of healthcare is transformative awareness of the ways in which background clinical assumptions held by clinicians, patients, society, how they influence and shape aspects of clinical practice, research, and education. And we outlined different aspects of it, assumptions, tools, discourse, humility. I don't have time to go in detail, but I encourage everyone to look up the paper and then sort of like see what our framework looks like. And I hope that this is something that the network will also will find of use. The educational formats that I sort of like tend to use in this regard: lecture series, discussion groups with assigned readings, journal clubs, reading elective. I do have to say my experience with American residents has been that it's very difficult to get them to read things that are, especially if they're like sort of like jargon heavy, if they're lengthy. And so I sort of like, if I'm teaching a general group of psychiatry trainees, I tend to rely more on lecture series. But if I'm dealing with a more self-selected group that have expressed interest, then it's only then that I use assigned reading, because otherwise I feel it's difficult to get them to read things because they're so busy, and I think that's the culture of education has been. And so if you look at our article, we do provide a sample list of suggested readings as well. This is not the entire list. I'm not going to go through it, but I welcome you to sort of like look up the article. I also offer an elective for interested residents, psychiatry residents. They can sign up for it. It's basically a reading and discussion elective. It's second-year residents, they can do it in a 2-week or a 4-week chunk. And third year and fourth year psychiatry residents who are more senior, they can do it in a more longitudinal format. And it basically takes the form of reading assignments with regular weekly discussions. And I found it sort of like a very effective way, basically because people are sort of like self-selected. They only sign up if they're interested, right? One thing I want to say is that I've kind of realized that improving education in philosophy of psychiatry, especially for medical trainees, is going to require us to transcend our silos and create more national, international resources. And because, if we stay sort of like isolated in our departments, we're not going to be able to have much of an impact here. So I want to sort of like, hopefully this network can provide that basis. And similar efforts have happened in other areas. So for example, there's the NNCI, National Neuroscience Curriculum Initiative, that focuses on neuroscience education for psychiatry trainees. And there's a national curriculum in reproductive psychiatry that focuses on women's mental health. And hopefully we can do something similar for philosophy of psychiatry as well. One quick word, there's been a lot of emphasis on including lived experience in various sorts of sort of like research leadership. And this is one area where education in philosophy of psychiatry is really lagging behind as well, is that we need more involvement of people with lived experience in psychiatric education and in philosophy of psychiatry education. And hopefully we can use the network to sort of like leverage the network to accomplish that. This is my email address again. I'll put it in the chat box as well. And with that, I'll wrap up my part of the presentation and let you enjoy the other speakers and panelists that we have. Thank you.